Good morning. My name is Andrew Dannenberg, and I'll be the moderator of this next session. The session is entitled What We Know and What We Don't Know About Weight, Physical Activity, and Health Outcomes for Cancer Survivors. This session is meant to provide a foundation for the rest of the meeting. There will be a total of 4 presentations. Each of the presentations will be about 20 minutes in length. And then at the end of the session, everybody will gather in the front for discussion, question and answer. So I would ask you to hold your questions until the end of the 4 talks. So on that note, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Pam Goodwin from the Mount Sinai Hospital in the University of Toronto. The title of Pam's talk is Overview of the Evidence of Cancer Outcomes Related to Obesity and Body Weight. Pam.
Thank you, and I want to thank the organizers for asking me to do this talk. You can probably tell from my voice, those of you that know me, that it's not completely normal. I am in week 3 of one of the worst bugs. I'm sure I'm not infectious, but I've got coffee and cough drops in case I need them during this talk. My talk is going to be very focused. I'm not taking a broad perspective on the benefits of physical activity and weight loss in cancer in general. I'm focusing down on specific cancer outcomes, recurrence, and death. Other speakers in this session are going to address this question from other perspectives. We know we're in the midst of an obesity epidemic. These are American data, but the data are similar around the developed world. Canada is not dissimilar from the United States. And this has raised a lot of concerns about associations of overweight and obesity with a number of illnesses, including cancer. These are some data that were recently published by IARC, and they have titled their conclusions in, I think, a very precise way. What they're talking about is evidence for a cancer prevention effect of the absence of excess body fatness. They're not saying if you're fat and you lose weight that your cancer risk will go down. They're saying if you are able to avoid excess body weight, your cancer risk will be lower. And what we see here is that for many of the common types of cancer, in individuals that are overweight and obese, there is an increased risk of developing those cancers. So esophageal adenocarcinoma, colorectal cancer, liver cancer, gallbladder, pancreas, postmenopausal breast, as well as premenopausal triple-negative breast cancer, uterine cancer, ovarian, renal cell, meningioma, thyroid, and multiple myeloma. And although our focus here is on cancer outcomes, I'm showing these data because they tell us that when individuals come to us with cancer, they're more often overweight and obese than the general population. And in fact, when you look at the population attributable risk of cancer that is related to obesity, about 1/4 of all of the high BMI-related cancer cases in 2012 could be attributed to the increase in BMI between 1982 and 2002. And in North America, Canada, and the United States, this number was over 1/3. So over 1/3 of the high BMI-related cancers, the list I showed you on the first slide, are due to the increase in weight that's been seen just in a 20-year period. And what this means is that patients diagnosed with cancer are more commonly obese than the general population. And this obesity has now been associated with poor outcomes in many cancers. And I want to emphasize the word associated. We don't know if this is a causal association. We don't know if reversing it will change things. And I'll talk us through those 2 points. But we do know that there is an association. As we've already heard, much of the work that has been done to date has focused on breast cancer, and we now have a number of meta-analyses looking at the association of BMI with the relative risk or hazard ratio of dying from breast cancer or dying from any cause. And what we see on the right-hand side of this slide is that for individuals with a BMI of about 30, the relative risk is 1.3 to 1.5 of dying from breast cancer compared to a woman who has a normal weight. One of my fellows took a look a few years ago at whether this association differed for ER-positive and ER-negative breast cancer, and at the time we saw significant associations with both types of cancers. There's been a number of recent studies suggesting that this association is most relevant in ER-positive breast cancer. It's not clear whether those observations are based on the selection of women for entry into randomized trials. Most of the recent data has come from randomized trials, are metabolically healthy women being selected. But this association, the presence of this association across both types of breast cancer is a matter of great discussion right now. Certainly for the most common type of breast cancer, there is a consensus that the association persists. There are a number of other cancers, and I want to review the data that are available. I've tried to focus on meta-analyses, which pull together all of the available data, particularly when those meta-analyses were recent. When we look at pancreatic cancer, what we see in the lower part of this panel is that being obese is associated with about a 15% increased risk of death in individuals with pancreatic cancer. For epithelial ovarian cancer, it's very similar, hazard ratio of 1.15 for obesity versus normal weight. With both of these cancers, there's not a significant increase for overweight versus normal weight. For endometrial cancer, this is one of the cancers that is extremely strongly associated with obesity in terms of risk. In terms of outcome, yes, there is also an association. Now, this slide goes up to, sorry, a BMI of 60. Sorry. You can see that when we look at a lower BMI, 35 to 40, the hazard ratio is 1.3 to 1.4. Prostate cancer, the relative risk of biochemical recurrence is about 20% increased in individuals with a BMI between 30 and 35. Colorectal cancer, if we look at the circles and we look at the middle number in each circle, this is the association of obesity with outcome. We see there's a 20 to 30% increased risk of a poor outcome in individuals who are obese, not as much in individuals who are overweight. In children with ALL, we see again about a 1/3 increased risk of death in individuals that are obese. Children with AML, very, very similar. So across a broad range of solid tumors in adults and hematologic malignancies in children, we see a modest association of obesity with, thank you, with poor outcomes in cancer. But there are some exceptions. And certainly in adult hematologic malignancies, in multiple myeloma, lower BMI is associated with a poor prognosis. In diffuse large cell lymphoma, lower BMI may be associated with a poor prognosis. And what we believe is happening here is that disease-related weight loss may actually contribute to prognosis. So the individuals that weigh the least actually have a greater disease burden, and it's that disease burden that contributes to the poor outcomes. Lung cancer. Lung cancer is one of the cancers that is not associated with obesity. In fact, there's an inverse association in terms of risk, and it's very similar in terms of outcome. Here, in the middle of the slide, you see the hazard ratio for obese versus normal weight for poor outcomes, and you see it's lower. In other words, they have a better outcome. Same for overweight. They have a slightly better outcome if they are overweight versus normal weight. And again, we think this may reflect disease burden. The individuals that have lower disease burden have lost less weight. And similarly for esophageal cancer, whether it's squamous cell cancer or adenocarcinoma, but a 20% better outcome in individuals who are overweight or obese as opposed to those that are normal weight. Renal cell carcinoma, similar. It's a nonlinear association. These are hazard ratios, not survival this time. But if we look at individuals with a BMI of around 30, this is the point estimate, and these are confidence intervals. We see that there's about I think this one ended up being about a 0.75 to 0.8 risk of mortality in individuals that had higher weight. So what do we see? How can I summarize this? Obesity is associated with a modestly higher risk of recurrence and or death in many of the common cancers. It's also associated with a modestly lower risk of recurrence or death in some cancers, long esophageal adult hematologic malignancies. And these are malignancies where weight loss is part of the presentation. And the greater the weight loss, typically the greater the disease burden. It is not my mandate to talk about the association of obesity and overweight with other aspects of cancer outcomes. I think you're going to talk about that. But I did want to include this one slide because this is a biological outcome. This is work done in breast cancer where we use cardiotoxic agents, anthracyclines and trastuzumab. And what we see is there's an increased risk of cardiotoxicity in individuals that are overweight or obese at the time of diagnosis. So when we look at biologic outcomes, there's an association with increased risk of recurrence and death, also an increased risk of this particularly important toxicity, cardiotoxicity. So what do we think is happening? I'm sure you've all seen this slide. Our hunter-gatherer genes have not evolved at the same pace as our lifestyles. Michelangelo's David has become Michelangelo's Mick David. This was published in Time magazine. I can't believe people still laugh. It means you haven't seen it yet, but this one has been around for a long time. When I show it in a breast cancer talk, I inevitably get an email saying, you know, show women, not men, but what the heck. And I've spent much of my career trying to understand what might be the biologic underpinning of the Obesity Cancer Association. I believe that it is a true association. I believe there's a biologic basis for it. I don't think this is just bias. I don't think this is just undertreatment of obese women or presentation at a later stage. I think there's a true biology here. And, Vuk Stambolik is a molecular biologist who has worked with me for the last decade and a half trying to understand this association. And Andy Dannenberg here in the audience, who's moderating this session, has also worked in this area. But when an individual, when an individual is obese, what we have is an increased fat mass. And this is associated with an altered systemic physiology. So the increased fat mass is associated with increased preadipocytes and inflammatory cells, higher levels of a number of cytokines, leptin, free fatty acids, cytokines, and inflammatory markers. And this is associated with an altered systemic physiology, higher insulin and insulin resistance, higher glucose or dysglycemia, free fatty acids, lipids, altered adipokines, higher estrogen levels in women, and higher circulating inflammatory markers. And these changes can impact cancer in a number of ways. The factors that are circulating that relate to the altered systemic physiology can actually directly affect cancer cells. They can alter signaling pathways, estrogen, insulin, PI3 kinase, JAK-STAT, and they can have direct metabolic effects on cancer cells. Whereas the changes in the adipose tissue can change the tumor microenvironment. There can be alterations in the cells that are in the microenvironment, but perhaps more importantly, evidence of increased localized inflammation, which changes the adipocyte and cytokine milieu and can lead to processes that promote cancer, increase cancer proliferation, promote invasion, and I'll talk about them a little bit in a few moments. But it is profoundly biologically possible that obesity can have direct effects on cancer cells as well as on the tumor microenvironment. And our group initially focused on insulin signaling. Insulin is elevated in obesity, and insulin receptors are overexpressed on cancer cells, and activation of these receptors by insulin can activate PI3 kinase and RAS signaling pathways, leading to reduction in cell death, increased protein synthesis, and increased cell proliferation, as well as altered gene expression. And this is one of our very early slides. We first presented this in 1999, showing insulin associated with obesity in newly diagnosed women with breast cancer, but more importantly, insulin associated with increased risk of distant recurrence and death, even after we'd adjusted for tumor and treatment-related factors, as well as BMI. So insulin was independently prognostic, and I'll come to that in a moment as well. This is work done by a group in British Columbia showing overexpression of the insulin receptor in breast cancer patients and showing that insulin receptor overexpression associated with worse survival. In colorectal cancer, C-peptide, which is a breakdown product of proinsulin when insulin was released, is associated with poor outcome, and IGF-PP1, which is inversely related to insulin, is associated with better outcome, basically consistent with our findings in breast cancer. There's also been work looking at glucose. Basically, glucose can, in the presence of abundant glucose, rapidly proliferating cells shift from oxidative phosphorylation to aerobic glycolysis. And what this does is it generates the precursors that are necessary for cell replication. It's less energy efficient, but it's essential in rapidly proliferating cells. And we reported that women with early stage breast cancer who had higher insulin levels, but typically within the normal range, there was only a couple that had elevated ones, have worse outcome independent of tumor and treatment related factors. A similar observation has been made in prostate cancer. And this raises the question about, are we looking at obesity? Are we looking at diabetes? Certainly there's an association of obesity with diabetes, both in individual patients and at a population level. And diabetes has been associated with poor outcomes in breast cancer, but it appears that this association is greatest for overall mortality and less so for cancer-specific mortality. And it raises the question of, are all overweight individuals metabolically unhealthy? And the answer to that is no. This is work done actually by an endocrinologist at our hospital. And what she showed was that even amongst obese individuals, there is a group that is metabolically healthy. And here the outcome is cardiovascular disease. But that obese, metabolically healthy group has a very modest increased risk of a poor outcome, whereas if they're obese and metabolically healthy, or even obese and metabolically unhealthy, or even normal weight and metabolically unhealthy, they have poor outcomes. So what is important is the metabolic health. Adipose tissue-related factors can also be associated with poor outcomes, and these are some of the adipokines and inflammatory factors. I've only pulled out a couple of slides here, but alterations in these factors can activate JAK-STAT pathways, NF-kappa beta signaling pathways, leading to proliferation, reduced cell death, and increased metastatic potential. These are some data from ovarian cancer showing that leptin, one of the adipokines elevated in obesity, is associated with poor outcomes. And Andy Dannenberg's group has worked a lot on what are called crown-like structures. These are dying adipocytes surrounded by inflammatory cells, and these are some of the changes that happen in obesity. These have been associated with poor breast cancer outcomes, and in some studies with the altered systemic physiology that is associated with the metabolic syndrome. And just one last example in this area, obesity is associated with hepatocellular carcinoma, and it's believed that the liver becomes fatty and that there are a number of changes in the liver that promote inflammation and the development of malignancy. So it's a very complex association. There's evidence supporting the biology of this association, but we have not proved in a linear fashion for any single cancer that one change definitely leads to cancer, or that changing it will be helpful. This is a study that was not on my radar for the longest time, and I think it's an important study. 137 ER-positive breast cancers. They confirmed that obesity was associated with poor prognosis. They looked at gene expression and found that at diagnosis, gene expression was significantly different in tumors of obese women versus non-obese women. They looked at genes that were expression of genes, and they found upregulation of, I think it's 62 genes, and downregulation of 59, and the upregulation related in part to insulin, adipokines, and inflammation. They then looked at the biologic changes in gene expression and linked them to the hallmarks of cancer, and found that many of them were linked to the hallmarks of cancer, and that insulin signaling and inflammation were the two most important pathways altered. And looking at gene enrichment, they found activation of the AKT pathway, which is the one that's activated by insulin, as well as epithelial and mesenchymal epithelial mesenchymal transformation, important in metastasis, and as well the development of metastasis. And what this is telling us is that the breast cancers that develop in obese individuals are biologically different than the breast cancers that develop in normal weight individuals. And that is critical in us doing due diligence in conducting studies like Jennifer Ligabel's that actually look at, does changing weight change the outcome of these cancers, or is the poor outcome biologically fixed? So, to conclude, do we have enough evidence to recommend lifestyle change to improve cancer outcome? I am not taking a broad perspective here. I am not saying that we shouldn't use lifestyle interventions, to enhance quality of life, to rehabilitate, to reduce toxicity. I'm specifically looking at the cancer outcome. And what we have here is an association. We don't know if it's causal. A non-causal association could reflect bias or confounding, undertreatment of obese, or more advanced stage of disease in obese. I think a lot of people have tried to look at these factors, and I think the association persists in studies that have controlled for these. So I think this is a real association. But if it's causal, we can't conclude that lifestyle change will improve outcome. Sorry, it still has breast cancer here. I should have made this more general. Because the inherent biologic aggressiveness of obesity-associated cancer may be fixed, and we may not be able to change it, even if there's weight loss post-diagnosis. Or the magnitude of change may not be feasible. The magnitude of weight loss may not be feasible, that is feasible may not be enough to change the outcome. So I strongly support randomized trials with cancer outcomes to look at whether we can change cancer outcome through lifestyle interventions. However, I am not against lifestyle interventions. People always ask me about this. We have programs for all of our patients at our center, and we have had for years. But I think what's important is that we're clear regarding the purpose of these interventions. Are we recommending them for general health benefits, reduction in toxicity, or are we saying to our patients that if you lose weight, you will have better outcomes? And I firmly believe that we don't have the data yet to say the latter, but I do think we have the data to say that these interventions will improve the quality of life and general health of our patients. Thank you.